When a woman's screams echoed through a Wyoming blizzard, a woman cast out in labor, a snowstorm that kills in minutes, a lone cowboy who hears what no one else will. What happens when survival depends on a stranger's choice, and when that choice changes two lives forever? Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Evelyn and Cole's journey reaches across the world. The blizzard came down like the wrath of something old and merciless, turning the Wyoming prairie into a white hell where direction meant nothing and survival meant everything. Wind screamed across the open land, ripping through bare cottonwood branches and hurling snow sideways in sheets so thick a man couldn't see his own hands stretched out before him. It was the kind of storm that buried cattle standing up, that froze creeks solid in an hour, that turned a 5-minute walk into a death sentence. And into this storm, they threw her. Evelyn Hart stumbled through the farmhouse door and into the howling dark, her swollen belly tight as a drum, pain radiating through her back in waves that stole her breath. She turned back once, hand outstretched toward the golden lamplight spilling from the windows, toward the warmth she could still feel on her skin. But the door had already slammed shut. The bolt scraped home with a finality that cut deeper than the wind. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from her lips and scattered into nothing. "Please, I'm—" A contraction seized her, vicious and sudden, doubling her over in the snow. She gasped, clutching her belly with both hands, feeling the tightness ripple through her body like a wave crashing against stone. It passed slowly, leaving her shaking and breathless, and when she straightened, the farmhouse was already fading into the white curtain behind her. They had waited until she was weak, until the baby was coming and she couldn't fight back. Thomas's mother had stood in the doorway with her thin mouth pressed into a hard line, her eyes cold as January ice. "You're not his widow," the old woman had said, each word deliberate and sharp. "You were never his wife in the eyes that matter. That baby isn't heart blood, and you'll get nothing from this family. Nothing." Evelyn had tried to speak, tried to explain that Thomas had married her in town, that the certificate was real, that the baby was his. But another contraction had hit her then, stealing her voice, and Thomas's brother had grabbed her by the arm and dragged her to the door. She'd fought, clawing at the doorframe, but he was twice her size and fury made him strong. He'd shoved her into the snow and slammed the door before she could scream. Now the storm swallowed her whole. She forced herself forward, one foot dragging after the other, her thin dress already soaked through and clinging to her skin. She had no coat, no shawl. The Harts had taken everything when Thomas died 3 months ago. His clothes, his tools, even the quilt her mother had sewn for the baby. All she had was the dress on her back and the child in her belly, and both were about to be buried under 6 feet of snow. The road was supposed to be here. She thought she was following it, but the snow had erased every landmark, every fence post, every familiar shadow. The world had become a featureless void of white and cold and wind, and Evelyn was alone in the center of it, her body betraying her with every step. Another contraction gripped her, harder this time, lasting longer. She dropped to her knees in the snow, gasping, tears freezing on her cheeks. The pain was enormous, all-consuming, a living thing that wrapped around her spine and squeezed until she couldn't breathe. She felt something shift inside her, felt the baby drop lower, and terror flooded through her so sharp it cut through the cold. Not here, not now, not like this. Not like, but her body didn't care what she wanted. It had its own rhythm, its own brutal timeline, and it was moving forward whether she was ready or not. When the contraction released her, she tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She crawled instead, hands and knees sinking into snow that came up past her wrists, her dress dragging behind her like an anchor. She made it 10 feet, maybe 15. Then her strength gave out and she collapsed onto her side, curled around her belly, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She was going to die out here. She and the baby both. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it settled over her like a blanket, soft and almost gentle. She was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of being afraid, tired of the cold that had seeped into her bones and turned her fingers numb and her thoughts slow and heavy. Maybe it would be easier to just close her eyes, to let the snow cover her, to stop. But then the baby moved inside her, a strong kick against her ribs, and something fierce and stubborn flared to life in her chest. No, she wasn't going to let them win. wasn't going to let the hearts take her baby's life before it even began. If she was going to die, she was going to die trying to live. Evelyn forced herself onto her hands and knees again, gasping with the effort. She could see a dark shape ahead, a tree maybe, or a rock outcropping. Shelter. Even a windbreak would be something. She crawled toward it, inch by inch, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The contractions were coming faster now, one rolling into the next with barely a pause between them. Her body was opening, preparing, moving toward a conclusion she couldn't stop. She reached the tree, a massive cottonwood, its trunk wide enough to block some of the wind, and dragged herself against it, pressing her back to the rough bark. The relief was immediate and small, and not nearly enough. She pulled her knees up as much as her belly would allow, wrapped her arms around herself, and tried to breathe through the next contraction. It came like a fist closing around her, squeezing until she screamed. The sound ripped out of her, raw and desperate, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. But she screamed again anyway, because she couldn't hold it in, because the pain was too big, because maybe, just maybe, someone would hear. Even though she knew no one was coming, even though she was miles from anywhere, even though the storm was too loud and too wild for any sound to carry, she screamed because it was all she had left. Cole Riker had been ranching long enough to know when weather was about to turn mean. He'd felt it in his bones that morning, a pressure in the air, a stillness that didn't belong. And he'd spent the day moving cattle to lower pastures, checking fence lines, and securing everything that could blow away or freeze solid. By the time the snow started falling in earnest, he was 5 miles from home and pushing his horse hard through drifts that were already knee-deep on the animal. He should have turned back sooner. He knew that. But there had been a section of fence down on the north ridge, and if he didn't fix it before the storm hit full force, he'd lose half his herd to the canyon. So he'd stayed, working with numb fingers and wind biting through his coat, until the job was done and the light was failing and the snow was coming down so thick he could barely see his horse's ears. Now he was paying for it. The gelding under him was a good animal, steady, strong, bred for mountains and bad weather. But even he was struggling. Cole could feel the horse's sides heaving, could hear the labored breathing, and he knew they both needed rest. But rest meant freezing, and freezing meant dying, so he kept them moving, following landmarks he'd memorized over 20 years of working this land. The wind screamed past him, driving snow into his face, ice crystals stinging his cheeks and clinging to his beard. He'd pulled his hat down low and wrapped a scarf over his nose and mouth, but the cold still found its way in, seeping through wool and leather and skin until it settled deep in his chest. His hands ached inside his gloves, his feet were numb in his boots, but he'd been cold before. He knew how to keep moving, knew how to push through when his body wanted to quit. The ranch was close now. Another mile, maybe less. He could picture it in his mind, the barn with its solid walls and dry stalls, the house with its wood stove and thick quilts, Mabel probably pacing the kitchen and cursing him for staying out so late. He'd be home soon. He'd strip off these frozen clothes, stand by the fire until feeling came back to his fingers, drink something hot, and... A sound cut through the wind. Cole pulled up sharp, his horse snorting and tossing its head. He listened, straining to hear over the howl of the storm. There. Again. Faint and broken, but unmistakable. A scream. Human. Female. Desperate. Every instinct in him went still and focused. He turned his horse toward the sound, urging the animal off the trail and into deeper snow. The gelding balked, ears pinned back, but Cole pressed with his heels and the horse obeyed, plunging forward through drifts that came up to its chest. The scream came again, closer now, ragged and raw. Cole's heart slammed against his ribs. No one should be out here. No one could survive out here. But someone was, and they were in trouble. And that was all that mattered. He spotted the cottonwood tree first, a dark bulk rising out of the white, and then the shape huddled at its base. Small, hunched, barely moving. Cole was off his horse before it fully stopped, boots sinking into snow, hands already reaching. He dropped to his knees beside the figure, and his breath caught in his throat. A woman. Young. Soaked through and shaking so hard it looked like seizures. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death, her eyes half closed and glassy. And her belly, God above, her belly was huge, round and tight under a thin dress that clung to her like a second skin. She was pregnant, far along. Maybe even... Her eyes flew open and locked on his, wild with pain and terror. She tried to speak, but only a broken sound came out, and then her whole body went rigid, her back arching, a scream tearing from her throat that made his blood run cold. Labor. She was in labor. Cole's mind went blank for half a second, pure shock wiping out thought. Then training kicked in, the kind of training that came from 20 years of birthing calves and foals, from handling emergencies alone on a mountain ranch, from knowing that hesitation killed and action saved lives. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then slid his arms under her knees and back and lifted her in one smooth motion. She was light, too light for a woman this far along, and she curled into his chest like a child, shaking so hard he could feel it through his shirt. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough and loud enough to cut through the wind. "Stay with me. I've got you." She didn't respond. Maybe couldn't. Her eyes were closed again, her face pressed against his shoulder, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Another contraction hit her and she screamed again, the sound muffled against his coat, her hands fisting in his shirt. Cole turned back to his horse, his mind racing. Home was still a mile off, maybe more in this storm. She wouldn't make it. The baby wouldn't make it. He needed shelter now, something close, something... The old trapper's cabin. It was a quarter-mile north, tucked into a grove of pine trees at the base of a rocky outcrop. He'd used it a few times over the years when weather caught him out, and it was rough but solid, 4 walls, a roof, a stone fireplace. It would do. It would have to. He laid the woman across his saddle, keeping one hand on her back to steady her, and grabbed the reins with the other. The horse didn't like the extra weight, the strange sounds, the smell of fear. But Cole spoke low and firm, and the animal moved forward, plowing through snow that seemed to get deeper with every step. The wind tried to push them back. The cold tried to steal what little warmth they had left. But Cole had been born in these mountains, had spent his whole life learning how to survive when the land turned hostile, and he wasn't about to let a storm beat him now. He found the cabin more by memory than sight, the trees rising up around them like sentinels, the small structure appearing out of the white like a miracle. Cole kicked the door open. It wasn't locked, never had been, and carried the woman inside, laying her down on the packed dirt floor near the cold fireplace. The cabin was dark and freezing, wind whistling through gaps in the logs. But it was out of the storm, and that was something. Cole moved fast, his hands working on instinct. He dragged his saddlebags inside, pulled out flint and steel and tinder, and had a fire going in under a minute. Flames caught and spread, throwing light and heat into the small space, and he fed it until it roared. Then he turned back to the woman. She was curled on her side, arms wrapped around her belly, her whole body shaking with cold and pain. Her dress was frozen to her skin in places, ice crusted in her hair. Cole grabbed a saddle blanket and laid it over her, then another, then his coat again. He needed to get her warm, needed to stop the shaking before it turned into something worse. But even as he worked, he could see the contractions coming faster, her body going rigid every few minutes, her breathing turning ragged and desperate. This baby was coming whether they were ready or not, and Cole knew, with a sick certainty that settled in his gut like lead, that he was about to deliver a child with nothing but firelight and instinct to guide him. He'd birthed calves in the middle of snowstorms. He'd pulled foals when mares were too weak to push. He'd seen life come into the world in barns and fields, and once in the back of a wagon on a mountain road. But he'd never delivered a human baby. He didn't know if what worked for animals would work for her. He didn't know if he could do this without killing them both. But there was no choice. No time. No help coming. Just him and her and a storm that wanted them dead. Cole knelt beside her and put his hand on her shoulder, feeling the violent shaking under his palm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady even though his heart was hammering. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, brown eyes, dark and glazed with pain. She stared at him like she wasn't sure he was real. "You're in labor," he said, stating the obvious because he didn't know what else to say. "The baby's coming. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay with me. Can you do that?" She didn't answer. just stared at him with those wide, terrified eyes. Then another contraction hit and she screamed, her back arching off the ground, hands clawing at the blankets. Cole grabbed her hands and held them, anchoring her, his grip firm and warm. "Breathe," he said loud and clear. "Breathe through it. It'll pass. Just breathe." She tried. He could see her trying, gasping and shaking and fighting to get air into her lungs. The contraction lasted forever, 30 seconds, a minute, longer. And when it finally released her, she collapsed back against the blankets, sobbing. "Good," Cole said, still holding her hands. "You did good. What's your name?" Evelyn, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Evelyn Hart." "I'm Cole Riker. You're going to be all right, Evelyn. You and the baby both. I promise you that." It was a stupid promise, the kind of promise he had no business making. But he said it anyway because she needed to hear it, because hope was sometimes the only thing that kept a person alive, and because he was damn well going to make it true. He let go of her hands and moved to the fire, melting snow in his tin cup and setting it near the flames to warm. He needed water, clean cloth, something to cut the cord with. His mind ran through the supplies in his saddlebags, a knife, some rope, a spare shirt. Not much, but it would have to be enough. When he turned back to Evelyn, she was watching him, her eyes clearer now, less glazed. "They threw me out," she whispered. "His family. Thomas died, and they said I wasn't his wife. They threw me out while the baby was—" Her voice broke and she squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Cole felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd seen cruelty before, men beating horses, neighbors stealing water rights, women left to starve when their husbands drank away the money. But this was something else. This was calculated and vicious and unforgivable. "They're not here now," he said quietly, "and they're not going to touch you or your baby. You have my word on that." Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet. But maybe the beginning of it, the smallest spark of hope in the dark. Then her face twisted, and another contraction slammed into her, and there was no more time for words. Cole stripped off his gloves and rolled up his sleeves, his hands already moving with purpose. He'd seen animals give birth 100 times. He knew the stages, the signs, the things that could go wrong. He knew when to wait and when to act and when to pray. But animals didn't scream the way Evelyn was screaming, didn't look at him with eyes that held terror and pain and desperation all at once, didn't make him feel like the weight of 2 lives was balanced on his hands, and one wrong move would send them both crashing down. "You're doing good," he told her, keeping his voice calm even though his heart was racing. "Real good. I need you to keep breathing, keep fighting. This baby wants to meet you." Evelyn gasped and nodded, her hands fisting in the blankets. Another contraction came, and another, each one harder and closer than the last. Cole lost track of time. Minutes blurred into hours, or maybe hours into minutes. All he knew was the fire burning behind him, the wind howling outside, and Evelyn's labored breathing filling the small space. He checked her between contractions, trying to remember everything he'd seen, everything he'd done with animals. The baby was coming, he could tell that much, but something wasn't right. Evelyn was exhausted, shaking with cold and pain, her strength fading with every push. "Come on," Cole said, his voice firm. "You've got more in you, I know you do. One more push. Give me one more." "I can't," Evelyn sobbed. I can't. "Yes, you can." Cole moved closer, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes locked on hers. "You're strong enough to walk through a blizzard while carrying a baby. You're strong enough to do this. Now push." She did. With everything she had left, she pushed, screaming through clenched teeth, her whole body straining, and suddenly Cole saw it. The baby's head, dark hair slick with fluid, emerging into the firelight. "That's it," he breathed. "That's it, Evelyn. Again. One more." Evelyn pushed again, and the baby slid free into Cole's waiting hands. A boy, small and slippery and perfect. For one horrible moment, the child didn't move, didn't cry, just lay still and silent in Cole's palms. Then the baby gasped, his tiny chest expanding, and let out a thin, warbling cry that was the most beautiful sound Cole had ever heard. Cole laughed. A short, breathless sound that was half relief, half disbelief. He grabbed his spare shirt and wiped the baby clean as best he could, wrapping him tight in the cloth. The cord was still attached, pulsing with blood, and Cole pulled out his knife, held it in the flames until it glowed, then cut through the cord with one quick motion. He tied it off with a piece of rope, his hands shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with him. Then he turned back to Evelyn and placed the baby in her arms. She stared down at her son, her face wet with tears, her hands trembling as she touched his tiny fingers, his dark hair, his perfect little face. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's alive." "He's alive," Cole agreed, his voice rough. "And so are you." Evelyn looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. It was small and exhausted and broken, but it was real. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you." Cole nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He turned away and busied himself with the fire, feeding it more wood, melting more snow for water. His hands were still shaking, his heart was still pounding. He felt hollowed out and raw, like he'd just lived through something that had changed the shape of him. Behind him, Evelyn was whispering to her baby, soft words Cole couldn't quite hear. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, by the light of a crackling fire, a new life had begun. And Cole Riker, a rancher who knew cattle and horses and survival, who had never expected to deliver a child in a blizzard, who had never thought of himself as anything more than ordinary, had become something else entirely. A man who had heard a scream in a storm and refused to let it go unanswered. A man who had chosen to fight when it would have been easier to ride away. A man who had just saved 2 lives, and in doing so had unknowingly set in motion a future neither he nor Evelyn could yet imagine. The storm didn't break until dawn, and by then Cole had learned more about suffering and resilience than 20 years of ranching had ever taught him. He'd kept the fire burning through the night, feeding it log after log while Evelyn drifted in and out of sleep, her baby pressed against her chest under layers of blankets. Every hour he'd checked on them both, watching the rise and fall of their breathing, making sure the cold hadn't found a way through his makeshift shelter. When the first gray light filtered through the gaps in the cabin walls, the wind had finally died to a whisper. Cole stood at the door, looking out at a world transformed into something unrecognizable. Snow had buried the landscape in drifts taller than a man, erasing trails and landmarks, turning familiar territory into alien ground. The sky hung low and heavy, promising more weather to come. Behind him, the baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a question. Cole turned to find Evelyn awake, her eyes clearer than they'd been all night, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "How are you feeling?" he asked, moving back to crouch beside her. "Like I got trampled by a horse," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Then frozen, then brought back from the dead. She looked down at the baby, her hand gentle on his head. "But alive. We're alive. You need food, water, proper care." Cole pulled his canteen from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "I can get us back to my ranch, but not until the snow settles some. Another storm like last night, and we won't make it 100 yards. Evelyn took the canteen with shaking hands and drank deeply. When she lowered it, her eyes were fierce despite the exhaustion written across her face. "I can ride. Whatever it takes, I can do it." Cole believed her. He'd seen what she was made of in those brutal hours of labor, seen her fight when most people would have surrendered, but belief didn't change facts, and the facts were simple. She'd just given birth in a freezing cabin, she'd lost blood, and she was weak whether she wanted to admit it or not. "We'll wait till noon," he said. "Give the weather a chance to clear and give you a chance to get some strength back." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of dried beef and some hardtack. "It's not much, but it'll help." She took the food without argument and ate slowly, mechanically, her attention mostly on the baby. Cole watched her for a moment, taking in details he'd been too focused to notice in the chaos of the night. She was young, early 20s maybe, with dark hair that hung in tangled waves around her face and eyes that had seen too much grief for someone her age. Her hands were rough, calloused from work, and there was a thinness to her frame that spoke of months of not eating enough. The dress she wore was simple cotton, cheap fabric that had probably been nice once but was now stained and torn. No coat, no shoes that he could see, nothing that suggested she'd planned to be outside at all, let alone in a blizzard. "They threw me out," she'd said. "His family said I wasn't his wife." Cole felt that cold anger settle in his chest again, the kind that didn't burn hot but stayed frozen and sharp. He'd met men like that before. Men who cared more about pride and property than about decency. Men who'd turn a pregnant woman out into a storm rather than acknowledge what was right in front of them. "The baby needs a name," he said, changing the subject before his thoughts could darken further. Evelyn looked down at her son, her expression softening. "Samuel," she said quietly, "after my father. Samuel Hart." She paused, then added with a bitter edge, "Though the Harts would say he has no right to that name." "The Harts aren't here," Cole said flatly, "and they don't get a say. You're his mother. You choose his name." Something in Evelyn's face shifted, a wall coming down just slightly, revealing the vulnerability beneath. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me. You didn't have to stop." Cole was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that. The truth was simple, but hard to explain. He'd heard a scream in a storm, and his body had moved before his mind could question it. He'd seen a woman dying and couldn't have ridden away if someone had put a gun to his head. It wasn't nobility or heroism. It was just what you did. What any decent person should do. "Couldn't leave you out there," he said finally. "Wouldn't have been able to live with myself." Evelyn studied him with those dark, careful eyes. "Most men would have." "Then most men are cowards." She almost smiled at that, a flicker of something that might have been humor if it had room to breathe past the exhaustion and pain. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by worry that creased her forehead. "Your ranch," she said, "your family. They'll be worried about you." "No family," Cole said. "Just me and my housekeeper, Mabel Crow. And she's used to me being late in bad weather. She'll fuss and curse, but she won't be surprised." "No wife?" "No." The word sat between them for a moment, simple and complete. Evelyn nodded slowly, processing this information, though what she made of it Cole couldn't tell. She shifted slightly, wincing as she moved, and the baby stirred against her chest, making those small questioning sounds again. "He's hungry," Evelyn said, a note of panic creeping into her voice. I haven't." "It's all right," Cole said quickly. "Your body knows what to do. Just let him try." He turned away, giving her privacy, and busied himself with checking his horse and preparing for the ride ahead. Behind him, he could hear Evelyn's soft murmurs to Samuel, could hear the baby's fussing turn to quiet, and he felt something loosen in his chest. They were going to be all right. Both of them. He'd make sure of it. By noon, the sky had lightened to a pale gray and the snow had stopped falling. Cole saddled his horse and helped Evelyn onto its back, settling her sideways with Samuel wrapped tight against her chest. He'd given her his coat again despite her protests, and he'd fashioned a sling from a saddle blanket to keep the baby secure. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. He led the horse on foot, breaking trail through snow that came up to his thighs in places. The cold bit through his shirt and vest, but he ignored it, focusing instead on finding the safest path, on avoiding drifts that could hide holes or fallen logs. Evelyn didn't complain once, though he could see her swaying with exhaustion, could see her arms tightening around Samuel every time the horse stumbled. It took 3 hours to cover what should have been a 40-minute ride. By the time the ranch came into view, barn and house rising out of the white landscape like a promise. Cole's legs were shaking and his lungs burned from the cold air. But they'd made it. They were home. The front door flew open before they'd even reached the porch, and Mabel Crow came charging out into the snow, her gray hair flying loose from its usual tight bun, her face a mixture of fury and relief. "Cole Riker, you damn fool! I thought you were frozen solid somewhere on that north ridge." She stopped short when she saw Evelyn on the horse, her eyes going wide. "What in the name of— is that a woman? Is she hurt?" "She needs help," Cole said, his voice rough from hours of not speaking. "Get the guest room ready. Hot water, clean sheets, whatever food you can put together fast." Mabel didn't waste time with questions. She turned and ran back into the house, already shouting orders to herself. Cole helped Evelyn down from the horse, steadying her when her legs nearly gave out, and half carried her up the porch steps and through the door. The warmth of the house hit him like a physical force, making his frozen skin burn and his eyes water. He got Evelyn into the guest room just as Mabel came bustling in with an armful of quilts and a basin of steaming water. The older woman took one look at Evelyn and the bundle in her arms, and her whole demeanor changed. The sharpness left her face, replaced by a gentleness Cole had only seen a few times in the 15 years Mabel had worked for him. "Oh, honey," Mabel said softly, setting down the basin and reaching for the baby. "Let me take the little one while you get warm." Evelyn hesitated, her arms tightening protectively around Samuel. Cole stepped forward, putting a hand on Mabel's shoulder. "This is Mabel Crow," he said to Evelyn. "She's tough as old leather and twice as stubborn, but there's no one better to have in your corner. You can trust her." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Evelyn slowly loosened her grip and let Mabel take Samuel. The older woman cooed over the baby, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle as she unwrapped the blanket and checked him over with practiced efficiency. "Born last night?" Mabel asked, not looking up. "In the old trapper's cabin," Cole said. "During the storm." Mabel's hands stilled for just a moment. Then she nodded, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "Well, you're both blessed to be alive, then." She glanced at Cole. "Get out. Let me tend to her proper." Cole didn't argue. He left the room and closed the door behind him, then stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to Mabel's low voice and Evelyn's quiet responses. His whole body ached. His hands were finally starting to regain feeling, pins and needles shooting through his fingers. He needed to check on his horse, needed to get the barn secured, needed to do 100 things that couldn't wait. But first he needed to stand here and let it sink in that they'd survived, that Evelyn and Samuel were safe, that the worst was over, or so he thought. 2 days passed in a blur of quiet routine. Evelyn stayed in the guest room, sleeping more than she was awake, while Mabel fussed over her with soup and tea and stern lectures about taking care of herself. Samuel slept and ate and occasionally cried, and the sound of a baby in the house was strange and jarring and somehow right all at once. Cole kept himself busy with ranch work, though he found himself checking on the guest room more often than necessary, just making sure they had enough firewood, he told himself, just making sure Mabel didn't need anything. But the truth was harder to ignore. He couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn's face in the firelight, couldn't stop hearing the sound of Samuel's first cry, couldn't stop feeling the weight of that moment when he'd held a new life in his hands and refused to let it slip away. On the third day, Evelyn appeared in the kitchen doorway while Cole was eating breakfast. She was wearing one of Mabel's old dresses, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, and there was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. Samuel was asleep in her arms, wrapped in a quilt Mabel had dug out of storage. "You're up," Cole said, setting down his coffee cup. "I needed to thank you properly," Evelyn said. She crossed the room and sat down across from him, settling Samuel carefully in her lap. "For what you did. For saving us. I don't have words big enough for it. You don't owe me thanks. I owe you everything." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with emotion. "You could have ridden past. You could have left us in that cabin, but you didn't. You brought us here. You've given us shelter and food and safety, and She stopped, swallowing hard. "I won't forget it. Ever." Cole shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude. "What are your plans?" he asked, changing the subject. "Do you have family somewhere? People who'll take you in?" Evelyn's expression closed off, that wall coming back up. "No," she said quietly. "My parents died when I was 16. Thomas was all I had, and when he died, his family made it clear I wasn't welcome. I have nowhere to go." "What about the law? They can't just throw you out if you were legally married." "They burned the marriage certificate." Evelyn's voice was flat, matter of fact. "Thomas and I married in town, but he kept the papers at the farmhouse. After he died, I asked for them, and his mother said they'd been destroyed. Said there was no proof we were ever wed, that I was just some woman he'd taken pity on. The town clerk might have records, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "The Harts have money, influence. Who's going to believe me over them?" Cole felt that cold anger stir again, sharper this time. "You're telling me they stole your husband's property and threw you out with nothing?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." "And the sheriff?" The court? Evelyn laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. The sheriff is James Hart's hunting partner. The judge is his second cousin. I learned real quick that justice isn't for people like me. She looked down at Samuel, her hand gentle on his head. All I want now is to keep my son safe. Everything else can burn for all I care. Cole studied her for a long moment, seeing the steel beneath the exhaustion, the fierce protectiveness that made her hold her baby just a little tighter. She reminded him of the Mustangs he'd seen in the high country, wild and wary, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger, but loyal to death once you earned their trust. You can stay here, he said, long as you need. Mabel can always use help around the house, and Lord knows I'm useless at anything domestic. You work, you earn your keep, and nobody bothers you. Fair enough? Evelyn stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a place to heal and figure out your next move. If that includes working, then yes. If not, the offer stands anyway. Why? The question came out sharp, almost accusatory. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything. Are you? No? Then there's your answer. Evelyn shook her head slowly, her eyes searching his face for something. Doubt, maybe, or ulterior motives. Whatever she was looking for, she apparently didn't find it, because her shoulders sagged and she let out a long breath. I accept, she said quietly. And I'll work. I won't be a burden. Didn't think you would be. Mabel chose that moment to bustle into the kitchen, carrying a basket of eggs and muttering about hens being stubborn in the cold. She stopped when she saw Evelyn at the table and her face softened. About time you came out of that room, she said. I was starting to think you'd forgotten how to walk. I wanted to thank Cole, Evelyn said. Good. Now you can thank him by eating something more than broth. Mabel set down the eggs and pulled a skillet from the rack. I'll make breakfast, and you'll sit there until every bite is gone. No arguments. Evelyn looked at Cole, something like amusement flickering across her face. She always this bossy? Always, Cole confirmed. Best to just surrender early. And so Evelyn stayed. The days fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Evelyn took over the kitchen work, insisting on earning her place despite Mabel's protests that she should be resting. She learned where things were kept, how Cole liked his coffee, which of Mabel's recipes were safe to modify and which were sacred. Samuel grew stronger, his cries louder and more insistent, and the sound of him became part of the ranch's background noise along with the wind and the cattle and the creak of old wood settling. Cole found himself adjusting to their presence in ways he hadn't expected. He started coming in for lunch instead of eating in the barn. He began washing up before dinner without being asked. He caught himself listening for Samuel's cries in the night, ready to help if Evelyn needed it, though she never called for him. And he watched Evelyn herself change as the days passed. The haunted look faded from her eyes. The tightness in her shoulders eased. She smiled more. Small smiles at first, barely there, but real. She laughed at something Mabel said one afternoon, a genuine sound that filled the kitchen with warmth, and Cole realized with a start that he'd been waiting to hear it. But beneath the healing, there was still fear. He could see it in the way she tensed whenever hoofbeats sounded on the road, in the way she kept Samuel close at all times, never letting him out of her sight, in the way she'd sometimes stand at the window staring out at the snow-covered landscape like she was waiting for something terrible to appear on the horizon. 3 weeks after the blizzard, that something came. Cole was in the barn checking on a mare who'd gone lame when he heard the sound of horses and voices in the yard. He walked out to find 2 men dismounting, one tall and heavy-set with a thick beard, the other lean and sharp-featured with cold eyes. Both wore expensive coats and rode good horses, and there was an air of entitlement about them that set Cole's teeth on edge. "Help you, gentlemen?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The heavy-set man turned, looking Cole up and down with barely concealed disdain. "We're looking for a woman," he said. "Young, dark hair, heavily pregnant last time we saw her. Goes by Evelyn Hart, though she's got no right to that name." Cole's blood went cold. "What's your business with her?" "Family business." The sharp-featured man spoke this time, his voice clipped and arrogant. "She stole property from our household and fled. We've come to collect what's ours." "Stole property?" Cole repeated slowly. That what you call a woman's belongings now? We call it theft when someone takes what doesn't belong to them. The heavy-set man, James Hart, Cole realized, putting together the family connection, stepped closer. We have reason to believe she came this way during the storm. If you're harboring her, you're breaking the law. Funny thing about the law, Cole said, his voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. It tends to protect people who have property and influence, but it also protects a man's right to decide who stays on his land, and I haven't seen anyone matching that description. It was technically true. The Evelyn he'd found in the snow had been pregnant. The woman in his house now was a mother, but the lie sat easy on his tongue because the truth would have been handing her over to wolves. James Hart's eyes narrowed. You're lying. You calling me a liar on my own property? I'm saying you'd be wise to cooperate. My brother and I are patient men, but our patience has limits. Cole took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He was half a head taller than James and broader through the shoulders, and he used that size now, letting these men see exactly what they'd be dealing with if they pushed. So does mine, he said softly. And you just hit it. Get off my land. The sharp-featured brother moved his hand toward his coat, and Cole's own hand dropped to the revolver at his hip. The movement was casual, unhurried, but the message was clear. You don't want to do that, Cole said. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension stretched tight as wire, ready to snap. Then James Hart smiled, a cold, calculating expression that didn't reach his eyes. We'll be back, he said, with the sheriff, with proof. And when we are, you'll regret this. I'll take my chances. The Hart brothers mounted their horses and rode out, but not before James turned back one last time. Tell her we're coming, he called. Tell her there's nowhere she can hide that we won't find her. Cole watched them disappear down the road, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Then he turned and walked back to the house, his mind already racing through options and outcomes. He found Evelyn in the kitchen with Samuel, but she was standing at the window, her face pale, her whole body rigid. She'd seen them. Of course she had. They're coming back, she whispered. They'll take him. They'll take Samuel, and I'll never... Hey. Cole crossed the room and gripped her shoulders, making her look at him. Listen to me. They're not taking anything. Not Samuel, not you, not a damn thing from this ranch. You understand? You can't stop them. They have money. They have influence. They have... And I have a rifle and 20 years of not backing down from bullies. His voice was firm, steady, anchoring her. We'll figure this out. But you have to trust me. Evelyn stared at him, tears streaming down her face, holding her baby so tight it was a wonder he didn't cry. Why? She asked again, desperate this time. Why are you doing this? Cole didn't have a good answer, didn't have words for the way something had shifted inside him that night in the cabin, the way saving her life had somehow become tangled up with his own, the way the thought of the Hart brothers taking Samuel made him want to burn the world down. So instead of answering, he just said, because it's right, and because I'm not letting them win. And in that moment, standing in the warm kitchen with snow falling outside and a baby crying softly between them, something unspoken passed between Cole Riker and Evelyn Hart. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something deeper than gratitude and stronger than obligation. The beginning of a bond that would be tested by law and cruelty and the bitter weight of injustice. A bond that would either save them both or destroy everything they were trying to build. The sheriff arrived 2 days later with the Hart brothers and a piece of paper that was supposed to make everything legal. Cole met them at the property line, rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his expression carved from stone. Sheriff Douglas Warren was a big man gone soft around the middle, with a florid face and eyes that couldn't quite meet Cole's. He held up the paper like it was a shield. Got a warrant here, Cole. Says I got the right to search your property for stolen goods and a woman wanted for theft. Theft of what, exactly? Cole asked. James Hart pushed forward, his face red with anger. A silver locket, 2 dresses, and a quilt. All property of the Hart household. She had no right to take them when she left. When she left, Cole repeated slowly. That's an interesting way to describe throwing a woman in labor out into a blizzard. We asked her to leave our property, the other Hart brother said, his voice cold. What she chose to do after that was her own business. Cole looked at the sheriff. You believe this horse shit, Doug? Warren shifted uncomfortably. Don't matter what I believe. I got a warrant signed by Judge Morrison. I have to execute it. Then execute it, but you're not taking anything or anyone off this property without me present, and you sure as hell aren't taking a mother and baby anywhere in this weather. The sheriff nodded, looking almost relieved. Fair enough. Let's get this done. They rode up to the ranch together, a grim procession that made Cole's stomach turn. Mabel met them at the door, her face set in an expression that could have frozen fire. Behind her, barely visible in the hallway, Evelyn stood holding Samuel, her eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Crow, the sheriff said, tipping his hat, I need to search the premises. Over my dead body, Mabel said flatly. Mabel, Cole's voice was quiet but firm. Let them in. Let them look. They won't find what they're claiming to look for because it doesn't exist. Mabel stepped aside with obvious reluctance. The sheriff and the Hart brothers entered, tracking snow across the clean floors, and began a search that was more performance than investigation. They went through the guest room, the kitchen, even the barn, looking for evidence of theft that everyone in the room knew was a fabrication. While they searched, Evelyn stood in the corner of the parlor, Samuel clutched to her chest, watching with the stillness of a rabbit surrounded by wolves. Cole positioned himself between her and the Hart brothers, his presence a clear barrier they'd have to cross to reach her. James Hart finally stopped in front of Evelyn, studying her with cold calculation. You're looking well, he said. Better than you looked that night. What was it you said? That you were dying? That we were murdering you? He smiled without warmth. Seems you survived just fine. No thanks to you, Evelyn said, her voice shaking but defiant. We offered you charity, a place to stay until the baby was born. But you insisted on claiming rights you didn't have, property that wasn't yours. James gestured at Samuel. That child is Hart blood. He deserves to be raised in a proper household, not by a woman with no means and questionable morals. Something snapped in Cole's chest. He stepped forward, putting himself directly in James Hart's space, close enough that the other man had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. Say one more word about her morals, Cole said very quietly, and I will throw you through that window, warrant or no warrant. The sheriff moved between them, hands raised. All right, that's enough. We've searched the property and found nothing. The warrant's been executed. We're leaving. Not without what we came for, the other Hart brother said. She's here. She admitted it. That's enough for what? Mabel cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. For you to drag a woman and a 3-week-old baby out into the cold based on accusations you can't prove? On theft charges for items you can't even prove existed? She turned to the sheriff. Doug Warren, I've known you since you were in short pants. Your mother would be ashamed of you right now. Warren's face went even redder. I'm just doing my job, Mabel. Your job is to uphold justice, not to be a puppet for rich men who can't stand being told no. Mabel crossed her arms. Now, unless you plan to arrest everyone in this house, I suggest you take these gentlemen and leave. The sheriff looked at Cole, then at Evelyn, then at the Hart brothers. Whatever he saw in their faces made his decision for him. We're done here, he said. Let's go. James Hart didn't move. This isn't over. We have rights to that child. Thomas was our blood, and the boy, Cole interrupted, has a mother who nearly died bringing him into this world, and she has a roof over her head and protection under my name. You want to challenge that, you're welcome to try. But you do it through proper legal channels, not by showing up on my property making threats. We'll see what the judge has to say about harboring a fugitive. I'm harboring an employee, a woman who works for me in exchange for room and board. You got a problem with that, take it up with the law. Cole's voice dropped to something cold and final. But you come onto my land again without an invitation, and the law will be the least of your problems. The Hart brothers left, but the weight of their threat hung in the air like smoke. The sheriff lingered at the door, his hat in his hands, looking older and more tired than Cole had ever seen him. They're not going to let this go, Warren said quietly. The Harts get what they want in this county. Always have. Then maybe it's time that changed, Cole said. Warren shook his head. You're a good man, Cole, But you're picking a fight you can't win. They have money, lawyers, connections. What do you have? The truth. Truth doesn't mean much when the judge is someone's cousin and the jury is made up of their business partners. The sheriff put his hat on and stepped out into the cold. Watch your back, and watch hers, because this is only going to get worse. After they left, Evelyn collapsed onto the sofa, her whole body shaking. Samuel had started crying during the confrontation and hadn't stopped, his wails filling the house with distress. Mabel took the baby gently, murmuring soft reassurances, and disappeared into the kitchen to warm some milk. Cole sat down beside Evelyn, keeping a careful distance, unsure how to comfort her when he could barely process his own anger. "You all right?" "No." The word came out broken. "They're going to take him. They're going to find a way to take Samuel, and there's nothing I can do to stop them." "There's plenty we can do." "We?" Evelyn looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "This isn't your fight, Cole. You've already done more than anyone could ask. But they're right about one thing. They have power and money and the law on their side. I'm just some woman with no proof and no rights. How am I supposed to fight that?" Cole was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything he'd learned in the past 3 weeks. About Evelyn's strength and Samuel's vulnerability, and the way the Harts twisted justice into something ugly and self-serving. An idea had been forming in the back of his mind since the brothers had first showed up, an idea that was probably crazy and definitely complicated, but might be the only way to protect what mattered. "There is a way," he said slowly, "a legal way that would give you rights they couldn't challenge." "What way?" "Marry me." The words hung between them, stark and strange. Evelyn stared at him like he'd lost his mind, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Even Cole wasn't sure where the words had come from, but now that they were out, he realized they made a terrible kind of sense. "Marry you," Evelyn repeated faintly. "You want me to marry you." "Not want. I'm offering you a solution." Cole turned to face her fully, his voice steady and practical. "If you're my wife, you have legal protection. The Harts can't touch you or Samuel without going through me first, and they can't claim the boy if he's part of my household, raised under my name." "That's insane." "Maybe, but it would work." Evelyn shook her head, standing up and pacing across the room. "You don't even know me. We've barely spoken more than a dozen words that weren't about survival or ranch work, and you want to marry me? To tie yourself to my problems for the rest of your life? I want to make sure you and Samuel are safe. This is how I can do that. By sacrificing your own future? By taking on a wife and child you never asked for?" Evelyn's voice rose, edged with hysteria. "What about what you want? What about finding someone you actually care about, having a real family?" "I'm 38 years old," Cole said quietly. "If I was going to find someone, I would have by now. The ranch keeps me busy. I don't need more than that." "Everyone needs more than that." "Maybe, but that's my choice to make." Cole stood and crossed to her, stopping a few feet away. "Listen to me. This doesn't have to be anything you don't want it to be. We'd be married on paper, legal in the eyes of the law. But how we live, what that means day to day, we'd figure that out as we go. No expectations, no pressure, just protection for you and Samuel." Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, looking suddenly very young and very lost. "Why would you do this? Give up your freedom, your chance at a real marriage for people you barely know?" "Because the night I found you in that storm, you became my responsibility, and I don't walk away from my responsibilities." Cole paused, then added more softly, "And because letting the Harts take Samuel would be wrong. I can't stand by and let that happen when I have the power to stop it." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. "You're a good man, Cole Riker, better than I deserve. You deserve a hell of a lot better than what you've gotten. But this is what I can offer. It's up to you whether you take it." Evelyn was quiet for a long time, her gaze distant, processing something Cole couldn't follow. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "If I say yes, if we do this, I need you to understand something. I cared about Thomas. I mourned him. But what we had wasn't love. It was survival dressed up as marriage. He was kind to me when I had nowhere else to go, and I was grateful for that. But I won't pretend it was more than it was. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. And I won't lie to you or play games or try to trap you into something deeper than you're offering. If we do this, we do it honestly. No illusions. Agreed. Evelyn took a shaky breath. Then yes, I'll marry you. Not because I have any right to ask this of you, but because my son deserves a chance at a life that's more than running and hiding in fear. She met his eyes, her own fierce despite the tears. And I swear to you, Cole, I will never make you regret this. I'll work hard. I'll pull my weight. I'll be a good wife in every way that matters. You won't be sorry. I know, Cole said. And he meant it. They were married 3 days later in the parlor of the ranch house, with Mabel as witness and the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through on his way to the mining camps. It was a simple ceremony, no flowers or music or celebration, just words spoken over a Bible and signatures on paper that would hold up in any court in the territory. Evelyn wore one of Mabel's nicer dresses, altered to fit her still slight frame. Samuel slept through the whole thing, wrapped in the quilt Mabel had given him. Cole wore his cleanest shirt and stood stiff as a board, while the preacher went through the traditional vows, feeling like he was watching the whole thing happen to someone else. When it came time to kiss the bride, he hesitated, unsure of the boundaries they were setting. But Evelyn rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his cheek, a brief touch that was more gratitude than affection, and the moment passed. Well, Mabel said when the preacher had gone and they stood awkwardly in the parlor, I suppose congratulations are in order, though this is the strangest wedding I've ever witnessed. Strange times call for strange solutions, Cole said. Mabel snorted. That's one way to put it. She looked at Evelyn with sharp but not unkind eyes. You're mistress of this house now, girl. That means you get a say in how things run. Don't let this old fool intimidate you into silence. Yes, ma'am, Evelyn said softly. That night, Cole gave Evelyn the master bedroom and moved his things into the smaller room down the hall. She'd protested, said he shouldn't give up his own bed, but he'd insisted. The room had been his parents' once, then his alone after they'd passed, and it felt right somehow to have her there with Samuel, like he was giving them something solid and permanent, a foundation they could build on. He lay awake for hours that first night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a baby in the house, of Evelyn's soft footsteps as she walked Samuel through a bout of crying. The ranch had been quiet for so long, just him and Mabel and the rhythms of work and weather. Now everything felt different, charged, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. The Hart brothers came back exactly 1 week after the wedding, this time with a lawyer in tow. Cole met them at the door, Evelyn standing just behind him, her left hand prominently displaying the simple gold band he'd placed there during the ceremony. Mrs. Riker, James Hart said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. How lovely to see you looking so well. It's Mrs. Riker now, Cole corrected. My wife, legally married and legally protected under my name. The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and a briefcase, stepped forward. We're prepared to challenge the legitimacy of this marriage. It's clearly a fraud designed to circumvent my client's legal rights to their nephew. Their nephew, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the way her hand trembled against Cole's arm, is my son. Born of my body, carried by me, nearly killed me bringing him into this world. They have no rights to him. They have every right, the lawyer countered. Thomas Hart was the father, making the child a legal heir to the Hart estate. Your marriage to Mr. Riker doesn't change that. Actually, Cole said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, it does. This is an adoption document, signed and witnessed, making Samuel legally my son. Not just in name, but in law, which means the Harts have no more claim to him than they do to any other child in this county. He'd filed the papers the day after the wedding, riding into town through a snowstorm to make sure everything was legal and binding. The clerk had looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but the law was the law, and there was nothing in the books that said a man couldn't adopt his wife's child. James Hart's face went purple with rage. You can't do this. You can't just steal our family's legacy. I'm not stealing anything. I'm protecting my family. Cole's voice was ice. Now get off my property before I make you leave. The lawyer started to speak, but James Hart cut him off with a sharp gesture. This isn't over, he snarled. We'll take this to every court in the territory if we have to. We'll prove this marriage is a sham, that you're conspiring to defraud us of our rights. And when we do, we'll take that boy and you'll never see him again." "Try it," Cole said. "But while you're wasting your money on lawyers and judges, Samuel's going to be right here, growing up safe and loved and protected. And every day that passes, he becomes more mine and less yours." They left in a fury of threats and promises, but Cole knew it wasn't finished. The Harts had tasted defeat, and it had only made them more determined. They'd be back with more lawyers, more warrants, more ways to twist the law into a weapon. But for now, Samuel was safe. Evelyn was safe. And Cole had made them a promise he intended to keep, no matter what it cost him. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began to happen. The marriage that had started as a legal convenience slowly began to take on weight and substance. Cole and Evelyn fell into routines that felt less like strangers cohabiting and more like partners building something together. She learned how he took his coffee and had it ready when he came in from morning chores. He learned when Samuel's fussy periods were and made himself scarce so she could tend to the baby without an audience. They talked more, cautious conversations at first, feeling out the boundaries of their arrangement. Evelyn told him about growing up in a sodbuster's cabin in Nebraska, about losing her parents to fever, about the loneliness that had made Thomas's proposal seem like salvation instead of the trap it had turned out to be. Cole shared stories about building the ranch from nothing, about the hard years and the good ones, about the satisfaction of creating something that would outlast him. Mabel watched it all with shrewd eyes and kept her opinions to herself, though sometimes Cole caught her smiling when she thought no one was looking. Samuel grew, changing almost daily in the way babies do. His eyes cleared to a deep brown like his mother's. His cries grew stronger, more insistent. He started focusing on faces, tracking movement, responding to voices. And Cole found himself drawn to the baby in ways he hadn't expected, spending evenings in the parlor watching Evelyn rock him, sometimes holding Samuel himself when she needed a break. The first time Samuel fell asleep in his arms, Cole felt something shift in his chest. This tiny life, so fragile and dependent, trusted him completely. And Cole realized that the adoption papers hadn't just been a legal maneuver. They'd been a promise, a commitment that went deeper than signatures on parchment. This was his son now, in every way that mattered, but peace never lasted long. The Harts filed their challenge in territorial court, claiming fraud and conspiracy, demanding custody of Samuel and seeking financial damages. Cole hired a lawyer, a sharp woman from Denver named Catherine Pierce, who specialized in family law and had a reputation for not backing down from powerful men. "They're going to dig into everything," Catherine warned during her first visit to the ranch. "Your finances, your character, your marriage. They'll try to prove Evelyn married you under false pretenses, that the adoption isn't valid, that you're unfit to raise a child." "Let them dig," Cole said. "They won't find anything that isn't true." "Truth doesn't always win in court, Mr. Riker, but we'll do our best." Catherine turned to Evelyn. "They're going to come after you especially hard. Your relationship with Thomas, the circumstances of his death, why you didn't fight for your rights sooner. You need to be prepared for that." Evelyn lifted her chin. "I'll tell the truth. All of it. Let them make of it what they will." The preliminary hearing was set for early spring, which gave them 2 months to prepare. 2 months of depositions and interviews and document gathering, 2 months of living with the knowledge that everything they'd built could be torn apart by a judge's decision. But it also gave them 2 months to become a family. And in the quiet moments between the fear and the preparation, in the evenings by the fire with Samuel between them and snow falling outside, Cole began to realize something that terrified him more than any court battle. He was falling in love with his wife, not the desperate, consuming kind of love that poets wrote about, but something quieter and deeper. The kind of love that grew from watching her gentle patience with Samuel, from the way she laughed at Mabel's dry humor, from the strength she showed in the face of impossible odds. The kind of love that made him want to protect her, not just from the Harts, but from every hurt the world could inflict. He didn't tell her, couldn't tell her. They had an agreement, boundaries they'd both accepted. Falling in love hadn't been part of the deal. But as winter deepened and the court date approached, Cole knew that whatever happened in that courtroom, whatever the judge decided, he was in this for life. Not because of duty or responsibility or legal obligation, But because somewhere between finding Evelyn in a blizzard and signing his name next to hers on a marriage certificate, she'd become the person he couldn't imagine living without, and he'd fight heaven and hell to make sure he never had to. The night before the hearing, Cole found Evelyn standing at the bedroom window, staring out at darkness broken only by starlight. Samuel was asleep in the cradle Mabel had found in the attic, breathing soft and even, unaware that tomorrow would decide his entire future. Cole knocked gently on the doorframe, though the door stood open. "Can't sleep?" Evelyn didn't turn around. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them taking him. See myself screaming and fighting and it not mattering because the law says he belongs to them." Her voice was tight, controlled, but he could hear the terror underneath. "How am I supposed to sleep knowing that tomorrow a stranger in a robe gets to decide whether I keep my son?" Cole stepped into the room, maintaining the careful distance they'd preserved for 2 months of marriage. "Catherine's good at what she does. She thinks we have a strong case. She also said truth doesn't always win." Evelyn finally turned to face him, and in the lamplight he could see the exhaustion written across her features. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands twisted together at her waist. What if it's not enough? What if the judge is friends with the Harts or owes them money or just decides that a rich family is better than a rancher and his convenient wife? Then we appeal. We fight. We don't stop fighting until... Until what? Evelyn's voice cracked. Until we run out of money? Until they find some law or loophole we didn't know about? Cole, they have everything. All I have is you, and I have no right to ask you to keep sacrificing for a battle that might be impossible to win. Cole closed the distance between them in 3 strides, taking her shoulders in his hands, making her look at him. "You're not asking. I'm choosing. There's a difference." His voice was firm, steady, the same tone he used to calm spooked horses. "I made you a promise the day we married. That promise didn't come with conditions or time limits. It's not about what's convenient or easy. It's about what's right." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. "I'm so scared," she whispered. "I've never been this scared, not even that night in the storm. At least then I didn't know what I had to lose." Without thinking, Cole pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest and finally letting herself break. She cried quietly, her whole body shaking, while he held her and said nothing because there were no words that could make this better. All he could offer was the solid presence of someone who wouldn't let go. When the storm passed, Evelyn pulled back slightly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be strong." "You are strong. But even strong people need to break sometimes." Cole brushed a strand of hair away from her face, the gesture more intimate than he'd intended. "Tomorrow you go in there and you tell the truth. You tell them about Thomas, about the Harts, about that night. You let them see exactly who you are and what you've survived. And no matter what happens, you remember that Samuel has 2 parents who love him. They can't take that away with any verdict." Evelyn searched his face, her expression something between wonder and confusion. "You really mean that, don't you? About loving him?" "I do. He's not yours, not by blood. Blood doesn't make a father. Being there does, protecting him does, choosing him every single day does." Cole's voice roughened with emotion he'd been holding back for weeks. "That boy is mine, Evelyn, in every way that counts, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take him from us." The word hung in the air between them. Us, not you, not just for legal protection. Us, like they were a unit, a team, something real and solid that existed beyond paper and convenience. Evelyn's breath caught. "Cole," but whatever she'd been about to say was interrupted by Samuel stirring in his cradle, making the small fussing sounds that meant he'd be hungry soon. The moment broke, and Evelyn stepped away to tend to her son, leaving Cole standing there wondering if he'd said too much or not enough. He left her to the nighttime feeding and went back to his own room, but sleep didn't come any easier than it had for Evelyn. He lay awake thinking about courtrooms and judges and all the ways tomorrow could go wrong, thinking about Evelyn's tears and the way she'd fit against him like she belonged there, thinking about Samuel and the fierce protectiveness that rose in him every time he looked at that baby. Somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, Cole made a decision. If the court ruled against them, if they tried to take Samuel, he'd fight. Not with words or lawyers or legal appeals. He'd take Evelyn and the baby and disappear into the mountains, live in some cabin where the law couldn't reach them, start over under different names in a different territory. He'd give up everything he'd built, if that's what it took to keep his family together. The realization should have shocked him. Instead, it settled over him like certainty, solid and unshakable. He'd found his line in the sand, the thing he wouldn't compromise on no matter the cost. And God help anyone who tried to cross it. They rode into town in the wagon, all three of them dressed in their best clothes, presenting themselves as exactly what they were: a family. Evelyn wore a dark blue dress that Mabel had helped her alter, her hair pinned up in a style that made her look older, more settled. Samuel was bundled against the March cold in a thick blanket, quiet and watchful. Cole wore the suit he'd been married in, stiff and uncomfortable but proper. The courthouse was a 2-story building at the center of town, imposing and official with its tall windows and carved stone. People gathered on the steps and whispered as the Rikers passed, their eyes following Evelyn with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Cole kept his hand on the small of her back, a clear statement of support and possession that dared anyone to comment. Catherine Pierce met them in the hallway outside the courtroom, her expression professionally neutral. The Harts are here with their full legal team. Judge Morrison is presiding. I won't lie to you. He's presided over cases involving the Hart family before and ruled in their favor, but he's also known for following the letter of the law, which works in our favor if we can prove everything was done correctly. And if we can't? Evelyn asked quietly. Then we appeal to the Territorial Supreme Court. But let's not borrow trouble. Catherine's gaze softened slightly. You doing all right? Evelyn nodded, though her face was pale as parchment. I'll do what needs to be done. The courtroom was smaller than Cole had expected, just a dozen benches and a raised platform where the judge would sit. The Hart brothers were already seated with their lawyers, 3 men in expensive suits who looked like they'd never worked an honest day in their lives. James Hart caught Cole's eye and smiled, cold and confident, like he'd already won. Judge Morrison entered and everyone stood, then settled again as he arranged papers on his desk. He was an older man, gray-haired and stern-faced, with eyes that gave nothing away. We're here regarding the petition of James and William Hart to nullify the adoption of one Samuel Hart by Cole Riker and to grant custody of said minor to the petitioners. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed. The Hart's lead lawyer stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced precision. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. The child in question is the biological son of Thomas Hart, deceased, making him the legal heir to the Hart family estate and bloodline. The adoption by Mr. Riker was fraudulent, undertaken as part of a conspiracy to deny my clients their rightful access to their nephew. We have evidence that the marriage between Mr. Riker and the defendant was a sham, created solely to circumvent legitimate custody claims. Evidence? Judge Morrison asked. The marriage occurred mere weeks after the defendant arrived at Mr. Riker's ranch. There was no courtship, no prior relationship, no foundation for a legitimate union. It was clearly a business arrangement designed to exploit legal loopholes. Catherine stood smoothly. Your Honor, the timing of the marriage is irrelevant to its legitimacy. Colorado territorial law recognizes marriages contracted for any reason as legally binding, provided both parties consent and all proper procedures are followed, which they were. We have the certificate witnessed and signed. The consent was obtained under false pretenses, Blackwell shot back. Mrs. Riker, if we can even call her that, manipulated Mr. Riker's charitable instincts to secure her own position. That's a lie, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the formal proceedings. Judge Morrison's gaze swung to her, sharp and assessing. Mrs. Riker, you'll have your chance to speak, he said. For now, I want to hear from Mr. Riker. Sir, please approach. Cole stood and walked to the witness stand, placing his hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth. Under Catherine's gentle questioning, he told the story simply and directly, finding Evelyn in the storm, delivering Samuel in the cabin, bringing them to the ranch, offering marriage as protection when the Harts came calling. And why did you offer marriage? Catherine asked. You could have simply let Mrs. Hart stay as an employee. Because I knew the Harts would keep coming, keep making claims, keep trying to take the boy. Cole looked directly at the judge. I'd seen what they were capable of. Throwing a pregnant woman out in a blizzard, lying about her legal status, coming onto my property with threats. I wasn't going to let them bully their way into taking a child from his mother. So you married her out of pity? Blackwell interjected. I married her to protect her. There's a difference. Did you love her when you married her? The question hung in the air, dangerous and exposing. Cole could feel Evelyn's eyes on him from across the room. He could see the trap Blackwell was laying. Admit he didn't love her, and the marriage looks like fraud. Claim he did, and it looks like a lie. I respected her, Cole said carefully. I admired her strength. I felt responsible for her welfare and the baby's. Love isn't always a lightning strike. Sometimes it's a choice you make and then live into. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Riker, I'll ask you directly. Do you consider this a real marriage or a legal convenience? Cole didn't hesitate. It's real. Maybe it didn't start the way most marriages do, but it's real now. Evelyn is my wife, Samuel is my son, and I'll honor those commitments until I die, regardless of what this court decides. Something flickered in the judge's eyes. Respect maybe, or at least recognition of sincerity. You may step down. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She took the stand with her head high, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. Under Catherine's questioning, she told her story in a voice that wavered but never broke. Meeting Thomas at a church social, his proposal after a brief courtship, the marriage that had seemed like salvation, his unexpected death from pneumonia 3 months into her pregnancy. And after his death, Catherine prompted, his mother told me I had no rights, that the marriage wasn't valid in their eyes, that I'd get nothing. Evelyn's voice hardened. She kept the marriage certificate, kept Thomas's possessions that should have been mine, made me work like a servant in exchange for a roof and food. And when the baby started coming, when I needed help the most, she had her sons throw me out. Into a blizzard, Catherine said, while you were in active labor. Yes. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even the judge's expression tightened. Blackwell stood immediately. Your Honor, this is all hearsay and emotional manipulation. We have no proof. You have my word, Evelyn interrupted, her voice ringing clear. And you have the fact that Cole found me dying in the snow. You have a baby born in a trapper's cabin because his grandmother valued pride over human life. What more proof do you need? Judge Morrison raised a hand for silence. Mr. Blackwell, do you have evidence disputing Mrs. Riker's account? We have testimony from the Hart family that she left of her own accord after they threw her out, Catherine interjected, which even by their own admission occurred on the same night she went into labor. Your Honor, the timeline alone proves their culpability. The legal arguments went back and forth for another hour, dense with precedent and procedure. But Cole barely heard it. He watched Evelyn on the stand, watched her refuse to break under Blackwell's aggressive questioning, watched her defend her choices and her son with the same fierce determination she'd shown in that cabin. When the judge finally called a recess to review the evidence, Cole caught up with Evelyn in the hallway. She was standing by a window, Samuel in her arms, staring out at nothing. You did good in there, he said quietly. Did I? Evelyn's voice was hollow. I can't tell. I can't read him at all. Morrison's a hard man to read, but he heard you. I could see it. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes searching his face. What you said, about love being a choice, did you mean that? Cole's throat tightened. This wasn't the time or place for this conversation, but maybe there would never be a right time. Yes. And have you? Made that choice? He could lie, could deflect, could protect himself from the vulnerability of admitting feelings that might not be returned. But he'd just sworn on a Bible to tell the truth, and it seemed wrong to stop now. Yes, he said again. I have. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, Catherine appeared at Cole's elbow. They're calling us back in. The judge has made his decision. The walk back into that courtroom was the longest of Cole's life. Every step felt weighted with consequence, with futures being written and erased. Evelyn's hand found his and gripped tight, and he held on like she was the only solid thing in a tilting world. Judge Morrison settled himself behind the bench and looked out over the assembled crowd. I've reviewed the evidence and the arguments presented by both parties. This is not a simple case. On one hand, we have biological family ties and legitimate questions about the timing and motivation of certain legal arrangements. On the other, we have a mother's rights and evidence of neglect, potentially criminal neglect, by the petitioners. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. Evelyn's hand trembled in his. However, the judge continued, the law is clear on several points. First, the marriage between Cole Riker and Evelyn Hart was conducted according to all legal requirements and is therefore valid. Second, Mr. Riker's adoption of Samuel Hart was properly filed and witnessed, making him the legal father regardless of biology. Third, and most importantly, the evidence suggests that the petitioner's treatment of Mrs. Riker was not only morally reprehensible, but potentially criminal. Abandoning a woman in labor during a blizzard could easily constitute attempted manslaughter. James Hart shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's outrageous. Sit down, Mr. Hart. The judge's voice cracked like a whip. I'm not finished. The petition for custody is denied. Samuel Riker will remain with his legal parents, Cole and Evelyn Riker. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Riker's departure from the Hart household. If evidence of criminal wrongdoing is found, charges may be filed. The courtroom erupted. The Hart brothers were shouting, their lawyers trying to call for order, spectators gasping and whispering. But Cole heard none of it. He heard only Evelyn's sob of relief, felt only her body sagging against his as the fear that had held her rigid for months finally released. It's over, he said into her hair. They can't touch him. It's over. But even as he said it, he saw James Hart's face across the courtroom, saw the cold fury there, and knew it wasn't truly finished. The legal battle might be won, but men like the Harts didn't accept defeat gracefully. They'd find another way to strike back. For now, though, none of that mattered. For now, they'd won. Samuel was theirs. The law had recognized what Cole had known in his bones since that night in the cabin, that this was his family, built from desperation and choice and something deeper than blood. They left the courthouse to a mixture of congratulations and cold stares. The town was divided, as towns always were when power got challenged. Some saw the Rikers as heroes who'd stood up to bullies. Others saw them as troublemakers who'd disrupted the natural order. Cole didn't care about either opinion. He cared about getting Evelyn and Samuel home. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them too wrung out for conversation. Samuel slept peacefully, unaware that his future had just been decided by strangers in a formal room. As they climbed into the foothills and the ranch came into view, Evelyn finally spoke. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for saving us, for marrying me, for fighting for Samuel, for making that choice you talked about." Cole pulled the wagon to a stop in the ranch yard and turned to face her fully. "I need to tell you something. What I said in court about love being a choice, that was true, but it was also incomplete." Evelyn's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I didn't just choose to love you. I mean, I do love you. Not because it's convenient or expected or part of our arrangement, but because you're brave and stubborn and you refuse to break even when the whole world is trying to crush you. Because you make this ranch feel like a home instead of just a place I work. Because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. "Cole, you don't have to say anything. I know that's not what you signed up for, but I needed you to know. Whatever happens from here, whatever our marriage becomes, you should know that for me it's real, completely real." Evelyn set Samuel carefully in his basket, then turned back to Cole and took his face in her hands. "You impossible, wonderful man, do you really think I haven't noticed? That I haven't felt the same thing growing between us?" Cole's heart stuttered. "You, what?" "I love you too, you stubborn rancher. I've been falling in love with you since the day you gave me your bedroom and moved into that small room without a second thought. Since the first time you held Samuel and looked at him like he hung the moon. Since I realized that you didn't marry me despite my problems, you married me because of them, because you couldn't stand to see injustice win. Evelyn." She kissed him before he could finish, a kiss that was soft and fierce and full of promise. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. "I think it's time we stopped pretending this is just an arrangement, don't you?" Cole laughed, the sound rough and disbelieving and full of joy. "Yes, Yes, I think we should. I... That night, for the first time since their wedding, they shared the same room. Not out of obligation or expectation, but because they wanted to. Because they'd fought their way through hell and come out the other side as something neither of them had expected to find. A real marriage, a real family, a real future built on the foundation of two broken people who'd refused to stay broken. And as spring finally broke through the last of winter's grip and the ranch came alive with new growth, Cole and Evelyn began building something that would last far longer than any legal document. They began building a life. Spring transformed the ranch into something alive and hopeful. The snow melted into rushing creeks, wildflowers burst from the earth in riots of color, and the cattle grew fat on new grass. Cole worked from sunup to sundown, repairing winter damage and preparing for the season ahead. But now he came home to something more than an empty house and a hot meal. He came home to Evelyn's smile and Samuel's babbling and the feeling that every hour of hard work was building toward something that mattered. The first weeks after the trial passed in a kind of golden peace. Evelyn moved her things into the master bedroom without ceremony, simply appearing one evening with her arms full of dresses and that same quiet determination she brought to everything. They learned each other slowly, carefully, navigating the shift from arrangement to genuine partnership. Cole discovered that Evelyn sang while she worked, old hymns and folk songs, in a voice that was surprisingly lovely. Evelyn learned that Cole read poetry late at night when he couldn't sleep, worn volumes of Whitman and Longfellow stacked beside his bed. Samuel grew with the relentless speed of infancy, his personality emerging in fits and starts. He had his mother's dark eyes and a stubborn set to his jaw that Cole recognized from his own reflection. The baby laughed easily, especially when Cole tossed him gently in the air or made faces that sent Evelyn into fits of mock scolding about teaching bad habits. "He's going to think the world revolves around making his father laugh," she'd say, but there was no real disapproval in her voice, just warmth. "Better than thinking it revolves around fear and obligation," Cole would counter, and Evelyn would grow quiet in that way that meant she was remembering things she'd rather forget. But the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. 6 weeks after the trial, Sheriff Warren appeared at the ranch with news that drained the color from Evelyn's face. The Hart family farmhouse had burned to the ground 3 nights prior. James and William Hart had been inside. Neither had survived. "Fire started in the kitchen," Warren said, standing awkwardly in the ranch house parlor, hat in his hands. "Spread fast. By the time neighbors saw the smoke, it was too late. They found both bodies in the main hall, looked like they were trying to get out." Cole felt Evelyn's hand find his, her grip almost painful. "How did it start?" he asked. "Can't say for certain. Overturned lamp, maybe. Spark from the stove." Warren shifted his weight. "Could have been an accident. Could have been something else." "Something else," Cole repeated carefully. "You saying someone set that fire deliberately?" "I'm saying there are people in this county who didn't appreciate how the Harts treated folks. People who thought they got off too light for what they did." The sheriff met Cole's eyes directly. "I'm not investigating it as arson. Don't plan to. As far as I'm concerned, it was a tragic accident and nothing more." After Warren left, Evelyn stood at the window for a long time, her arms wrapped around herself. Cole came up behind her, close but not touching, waiting for her to speak first. "I should feel something," she said finally. "Guilt, maybe, or sorrow, or they were Samuel's blood family, regardless of how they treated us. But all I feel is relief. Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you human." Cole put his hands on her shoulders, gentle but grounding. "They tried to kill you and take your son. You don't owe them grief. But I can't help wondering if we caused this somehow. If standing up to them, winning in court, if that pushed someone to—" She broke off, shaking her head. "I know we didn't light any fire, but our victory might have given someone else permission to seek justice their own way. You can't take responsibility for other people's choices. We fought them in court, legally and properly. What happened after that wasn't on us." Evelyn turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face. "Do you really believe that?" "I do." Cole tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "And I think the sheriff does too, or he wouldn't have made a point of telling us he's not investigating. He's giving us permission to let it go. I think we should take it." She nodded slowly, then leaned her forehead against his chest. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. for some new threat to appear. When do we get to just be happy without looking over our shoulders? Starting now, Cole said firmly. The hearts are gone. The legal fight is over. Nothing's standing between us and the future we choose to build. So let's build it. And they did. 2 weeks after the fire, a lawyer from Cheyenne arrived with papers that made Evelyn's breath catch. The Hart estate, what remained of it after debts were settled, had been left to Samuel as the last surviving heir. It wasn't the fortune the Harts had protected so jealously, but it was substantial: 30 acres of good farmland, some livestock, and enough cash to make a real difference. They fought so hard to keep him from having any of this, Evelyn said, staring at the documents spread across the kitchen table. And in the end, he inherited it anyway. There's something darkly poetic about that. Cole studied the land survey, his mind already working through possibilities. This property borders our southern pasture. If we combine them, we'd have enough grazing land to double our herd. Could build something significant. Our herd, Evelyn said softly, looking up at him. You said our. Well, it is. You're my partner in this ranch, same as you're my partner in everything else. Cole reached across the table and took her hand. What do you want to do with it? It's Samuel's inheritance, which means it's your decision. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. I want to use it to build something good, something that honors the life Samuel should have had with his father, but also acknowledges the life he has now. With you. With us. She looked up, her eyes bright with determination. Let's combine the properties. Build that future you talked about. And when Samuel's old enough, we'll tell him the whole story, where he came from, what we fought for, why these acres matter. That's a good plan, Cole said. A damn good plan. They merged the properties that summer, a legal process that required trips to town and signatures and official seals. But when it was done, the Sunrise Ridge Ranch had grown from a modest operation into something with real weight and permanence. Cole hired 2 ranch hands to help with the expanded work. Young men from town who needed jobs and didn't ask questions about the family's complicated history. Evelyn threw herself into making the ranch not just functional, but beautiful. She planted a garden that produced vegetables enough to feed them through winter, with plenty left to sell in town. She sewed curtains for every window and hooked rugs for the floors. She convinced Cole to add a proper porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Mabel watched it all with satisfaction, her sharp tongue softened by genuine affection for the family she'd helped create. About time this place felt like a home instead of a bachelor's camp, she'd mutter, but her eyes were warm when she said it. Samuel took his first steps that autumn, tottering across the parlor floor into Cole's waiting arms. The moment was perfect and ordinary and extraordinary all at once, the kind of milestone that parents had celebrated since the beginning of time. But for Cole, it carried extra weight. This child who'd been born in a blizzard, fought over in court, and nearly lost to cruelty was now walking, growing, becoming his own person. He's going to be running before you know it, Evelyn said, laughing as Samuel immediately demanded to do it again. And then we'll never keep up. Then we'd better cherish these slow moments while we have them. But life had more changes in store. That winter, Evelyn told Cole she was pregnant again. They were in the barn when she shared the news, Cole mucking out stalls while she brought him lunch. She waited until he'd set down his fork before speaking, her hands clasped together at her waist. I'm expecting, she said simply. About 3 months along, I think. Cole stared at her, the words taking a moment to process. Then joy flooded through him so intense it almost hurt. You're sure? As sure as I can be. I felt this before, and all the signs are there. He crossed to her in 2 strides and lifted her off her feet, spinning her once before setting her down carefully, mindful of her condition. We're having a baby, he said, wonder in his voice. A baby that's ours from the start. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid you might not want more children. Samuel's not even 2 yet, and adding another... Are you joking? This is the best news I could imagine. Cole cupped her face in his hands. You've given me everything, Evelyn. A family, a purpose, a reason to build instead of just maintain. Another child? That's not a burden. That's a blessing. The pregnancy was easier than her first had been. Or maybe it just seemed that way because this time she wasn't alone and terrified. Cole fussed over her like she was made of glass, earning exasperated lectures from both Evelyn and Mabel about treating pregnant women like they were dying. But he couldn't help it. The thought of anything going wrong, of losing either her or the baby, was unbearable. Their daughter was born in late spring, delivered by the town doctor in the master bedroom, with Mabel assisting and Cole pacing holes in the hallway floor. When Mabel finally called him in, he found Evelyn exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny red-faced baby with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your daughter," Evelyn said softly. "I was thinking we could name her Rose, after your mother." Cole's throat closed. His mother had died when he was 15, taken by the same fever that had claimed his father a year later. He hadn't spoken her name in years, the grief too sharp. But looking at this perfect new life, he felt something shift. Not the pain leaving, but making room for something else. For continuation. For hope. "Rose," he repeated hoarsely. Rose Riker. She'd have loved that. Samuel was fascinated by his new sister, toddling over to the cradle constantly to stare at her with wide, serious eyes. "Baby!" he'd announce proudly, like he'd personally created this marvel. Evelyn would laugh and pull him into her lap, explaining that he was the big brother now and had important jobs to do. The ranch thrived. Cole's careful management and the expanded acreage allowed them to build a herd that was the envy of surrounding counties. They weathered droughts and hard winters, prairie fires and cattle rustlers, but they weathered them together. Evelyn proved to have a head for numbers and took over the ranch accounts, her neat ledgers showing profits that steadily climbed year after year. They added to the house, building 2 more bedrooms for the children and a proper study where Cole could handle business without spreading papers across the kitchen table. They bought better horses, improved breeding stock, invested in equipment that made the work less backbreaking. But more than the physical growth, the ranch became a place people pointed to as proof that good things could come from hard beginnings. The story of Cole finding Evelyn in the blizzard became local legend, told with varying degrees of accuracy in saloons and churches across the county. Some versions made Cole out to be a saint. Others cast Evelyn as a scheming woman who'd trapped a good man. Neither version was quite true, but Cole and Evelyn stopped trying to correct the record. They knew their own truth, and that was enough. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch and showed early signs of having his father's way with animals. Rose was her mother's daughter, fierce and independent, quick to laugh, and just as quick to defend herself or her brother. 2 more children followed, a son they named Thomas after Evelyn's first husband, honoring the man who'd shown her kindness even if their marriage had been born of desperation, and another daughter they called Margaret after Mabel, who cried when they told her. The years accumulated like snow, each one adding layers to the foundation they'd built. Samuel learned to rope and ride, helped with roundups, proved himself capable and reliable. Rose demanded to learn everything her brother learned, refusing to be sidelined because of her gender. Thomas was quieter, more bookish, but showed a talent for understanding the land itself in ways that would serve the ranch well. Margaret was still small, but already showing signs of having inherited Mabel's sharp tongue and sharper wit. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Cole surprised Evelyn with a trip to town for dinner at the hotel restaurant, leaving the children with Mabel and spending an evening that felt stolen from their usual responsibilities. They dressed in their finest clothes and sat across from each other at a table lit by candles, and for a few hours they were just a man and woman enjoying each other's company. "Do you ever regret it?" Evelyn asked over dessert, taking on a pregnant stranger and all the complications that came with her. Cole reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he'd made 100 times before, but which never lost its meaning. Not once, not for a single moment. Even when the Harts were threatening to take everything? Even when the whole county was talking about us? Especially then, because that's when I learned what you were made of, what we were made of together. He smiled, the expression softening the weathered lines of his face. "You gave me a family, Evelyn. You gave me 4 children and a reason to build something that outlasts me. But more than that, you gave me yourself, your strength, your love, your partnership. How could I regret the best decision I ever made?" Evelyn's eyes shimmered with tears. "I was so scared that night. In the storm, in the cabin, in the courtroom. Scared of dying, scared of losing Samuel, scared of hoping for something good, because every time I'd hoped before, it had been ripped away. But you never wavered, never doubted. You just kept choosing me, choosing us, until I finally believed we deserved to be chosen. You always deserved it. I just helped you see it." They walked home through the spring darkness, hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing. About Samuel's growing interest in horse breeding and Rose's insistence on learning to shoot. About Thomas's latest obsession with cataloging every plant on the property and Margaret's campaign to convince them she needed a puppy. About the ranch's future and their children's futures, and all the tomorrows they'd build together. When they reached the house, Cole pulled Evelyn close before they went inside. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like salt, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. It was the same land where he'd heard her screams in a blizzard 10 years ago, but it felt like a different world now. A better one. "I love you," he said simply, in case I don't say it enough. "You say it every day, in 100 different ways." Evelyn rose on her toes and kissed him. "But I never get tired of hearing it." Inside, Mabel had put the younger children to bed, but Samuel and Rose were still awake, building something elaborate with wooden blocks in the parlor. They looked up when their parents entered, and Rose immediately launched into an explanation of the fort they were constructing and why it needed to be exactly this size and shape. Cole listened with half his attention, the other half absorbed in simply watching his family. His children, healthy and happy and safe. His wife, beautiful in the lamplight, laughing at something Samuel said. His life, built from desperation and choice and love that had grown from the smallest spark into something that warmed everything it touched. Years later, when Samuel was grown and running the ranch alongside his father, when Rose had married a neighboring rancher and started her own family, when Thomas had gone east to study agriculture and brought back ideas that revolutionized their operation, when Margaret had become the town's first female lawyer and made a name fighting for women's rights. When all of this had come to pass, Evelyn finally sat down to write the story. She was in her 60s by then, her dark hair streaked with gray, her hands marked by decades of hard work. But her mind was sharp and her memories were clear, and she felt compelled to put it all down before time could steal the details. She wrote about the blizzard and the cabin and the man who'd heard her screams and refused to ride away. She wrote about the legal battles and the fear and the moments when everything hung by a thread. She wrote about falling in love with her husband slowly, like ice melting in spring, until one day she looked at him and couldn't remember what her life had been before he was in it. But mostly she wrote about the children, about Samuel, who'd been born in a storm and grown up to be a man of quiet strength and deep compassion. About Rose and Thomas and Margaret and the two who'd come after them, each one a different expression of the love that had built this family. About the ranch that had grown from a place of refuge into a legacy that would outlast them all. She wrote about how a woman cast out to die had instead found life, how a man who'd thought himself too old and too settled for family had discovered he'd just been waiting for the right one, how love didn't always arrive with trumpets and romance. Sometimes it came in the form of a stranger who chose to stop when everyone else would have ridden past. On her last page, Evelyn wrote this: "They say love is a lightning strike, a moment of magic that changes everything in an instant. But that's not the whole truth. Sometimes love is a man hearing a scream in a storm and choosing to investigate when it would be safer to go home. Sometimes it's a woman trusting a stranger with her life and her child's life because she has no other choice. Sometimes it's two people deciding to be partners before they're ready to be lovers, and learning as they go that partnership is its own kind of love. Our story didn't start with romance. It started with survival. But survival became protection. Protection became partnership. Partnership became love. And love became everything else. Our children, our ranch, our life. All of it grew from that one moment when Cole Riker heard my screams and chose to help instead of riding away. So if you're reading this years from now, if you're one of our grandchildren or great-grandchildren wondering where you came from, this is your answer. You came from a choice, from kindness in the face of cruelty, from love that was built one day at a time until it became strong enough to weather anything. You came from a blizzard and a man who wouldn't let it win, and that is the greatest legacy I can imagine." Evelyn set down her pen and looked out the window at the ranch spread below, at the land that had become home, at the life she'd built from nothing. Cole was in the south pasture with Samuel and Thomas, checking fence lines before winter set in. Rose was in the barn with her own children, teaching them to ride the way her father had taught her. Margaret was in town, probably arguing with some judge about women's suffrage or property rights. The house was full of voices and laughter and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from a large, loving family. It was everything Evelyn had never dared hope for during those dark months with the Harts, everything she'd thought she'd lost the night they threw her into the storm. But she hadn't lost it. She'd found it in the most unlikely place, in the arms of a man who'd proven that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It was about showing up, about doing what was right when it would be easier to do nothing, about choosing love over convenience again and again until that choice became the bedrock of a life. When Cole came home that evening, tired and dirty from a day's work, he found Evelyn in the study with the manuscript spread before her. He read over her shoulder in silence, then pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You got it right," he said simply. "Did I?" "Every word." He pulled up a chair beside her. "Though you could have mentioned how stubborn you were about accepting help in those early days." Evelyn laughed. "And you could have mentioned how you burned 3 dinners in a row trying to prove you didn't need Mabel's help in the kitchen." "We were both stubborn, still are." Cole took her hand, his thumb tracing the gold band she'd worn for over 30 years. "But we were stubborn together, and that made all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell outside and the house settled around them. Somewhere above them, their grandchildren were being put to bed with stories and songs. Somewhere beyond the windows, the ranch hummed with life they'd created and sustained. And in that quiet moment, with their hands clasped and their story complete, Cole and Evelyn Riker knew a truth that couldn't be written in any book. That the best lives weren't the ones that started perfect, but the ones that refused to let imperfect beginnings define their endings. They'd been cast into a storm, both of them in different ways. But instead of letting it destroy them, they'd used it to forge something unbreakable. A love that had survived courts and cruelty, poverty and plenty, tragedy and triumph. A love that had started with a scream in the dark and a man who'd answered. And that would be enough, more than enough. It would be everything.